So welcome. Hello, everyone. I'm Juliana Herman. I'm president-elect of Women's Masters Network Houston. WMN is a professional network of women dedicated to increasing their potential through networking and educational events focused on leadership and personal and professional development. We're building a community that inspires and empowers women in the pursuit of leadership and career fulfillment. Welcome. And today, and you can also check out our website. I'll go through some of our upcoming events at the end as well. We have both virtual like this one and in-person events coming up. This series is supported by Energy Gigs. Energy Gigs makes it easy for people and companies to connect and quickly launch projects, improving our current and future energy resources. Whether you're looking to find energy experts or be found, you can set up your profile today at energygigs.com. That is the recap of our organizations done. And so today we're welcoming Meha Jha. I met her, I think there are a few different paths. We worked for the same company for a little while, but we also worked on Young Women Energized events together. And she's going to go through and kind of give a little bit of her background to start and go through a couple slides. I want to let you know we have the Q&A. You can type in questions or feel free to use the chat. And I know that there's some interactive portions of the presentation, so we want to encourage you to kind of get in the chat and in the Q&A. Welcome. Let's get started.
Great. Thank you. So Juliana, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this is really exciting to be connected into Women's Masters Network and Energy Gigs. So I used to actually live in Houston. You'll kind of see in my little background over here. I used to live in Houston for probably about, oh my gosh, well, Texas, I think like 8 years, and then just Houston for about 7 of those years. And I really kind of am excited to be tethered back into the energy industry. I'm now based out of Atlanta, so it's not as energy centric as it was for me when I was living in Houston. However, my job is still heavily tied to the energy industry. And so I really kind of titled this initial slide career dynamics. And I really kind of like the word dynamic because I feel like that really characterizes the energy industry a lot today. So before Juliana and I kicked off this call, we were talking about probably back when we first started to get to know each other, which I think was like before 2019. We used to kind of, in the Houston world, we would think of like the main dynamic impacting our career or our jobs or our economy was really the oil price. And we would talk about oil being cyclical. And if you look at kind of this big eye chart of sort of my like kind of career, if you look at the bottom like portion of the chart where you see kind of these 4 or 5 different lines. So from kind of 2015 to 2022, you'll see kind of just in the last 7 like years or so. So I'm not including the 2015, but kind of 7, 8 years of just other things that have started to come into play that aren't just necessarily oil price related or finding a new area to drill oil. There's a lot that's changed. And with that, we really have to kind of look at the evolution of how our careers should be changing or evolving to stay relevant. So when I kind of zoom out and look at kind of my career history that you see more so towards the top of this chart, I feel like when I first started working 10 years ago, most of the time I would see your typical step ladder career path that executives would show, where it was kind of like linear, right? And it was like, oh, I moved over to this region, I took over a larger business. It was kind of those type of moves. Whereas if you kind of look at my headings, I've had functional changes, industry sort of changes, which in the energy industry for us, a lot of times that's kind of maybe just moving up and down the value chain. But then technology is kind of a new one that I'm putting up here as a sort of new area for us to explore. So kind of diving deeper, I think you can kind of see the different changes that I've made in my career and the background towards energy functional has remained pretty consistent. However, there's been a couple, two, I would say, kind of mega trends that have caused a couple pivots really fast in my career. So if you kind of look at it, I was at the same company probably for about my first 8 years. And then within the last couple years, I got recruited back-to-back years. Honestly, not aggressively looking in the market. Even at one point, I didn't even have like on LinkedIn, where you can say like looking for jobs. I didn't have any that activated, but sustainability really took off. And in the last couple years, and that really led to my last two most recent opportunities. But I would say, kind of just looking back, maybe it was post-pandemic for me, about 2020, 2021, I kind of noticed a couple of those big trends that I mentioned where my role naturally evolved to start covering more of the sustainability spaces, because at the time refineries were investing in biofuels. So that naturally started to extend my traditional core role that was refining, where some refineries were completely closing down, converting fully, or adding a facility. And so that kind of got me into the sustainability space. And then one of the big things that I noticed about my career, so I usually have been in the industrial automation space. So that is typically being kind of, an equipment supplier or vendor to production facilities. And that's beyond just the typical oil and gas industries, but predominantly I've been in the oil and gas space. And what I noticed that really started to take off is that when I looked at the hardware, so I was in instrumentation, there wasn't as much that I saw my company investing in, because they were really trying to build out and become a software company. And, everybody was talking about software as like the future. And when you look at instrumentation and hardware, a lot of this equipment has been around for a long time. And usually when you're innovating, it's really on the kind of the software side, the communication protocol, right? A lot of the materials, or maybe you shrink the design, right? You make it less parts or things like that. But in reality, a lot of where I saw the innovation going, and I think it's just even more recently accelerated with sort of this generative AI space, was really in software. So that's when I kind of realized for myself of continuing to want to be relevant and build opportunities, I not only needed maybe an industry or domain adjustment, right, towards sustainability, but also a technology adjustment. And so I kind of want to pause there with that like kind of quick intro, because I know there's a lot on this slide. And I'm curious in the audience, and Juliana is watching the chat for me, or Juliana yourself, if you'd like to chime in. I'm curious if you look at these 4 or 5 things that I plotted, just within just my span of my last sort of 10 years of working, I'm curious if I missed anything, or that you guys have seen something else that you feel like you've seen cause your company, your career to pivot, the industry to adapt in a different way. So I just want to pause and see or hear from you guys on that. And one thing, while I guess waiting to see if y'all will chat something, I did want to highlight what was interesting when I went back to plot these years, the 2015 to 2022. I did want to point out a couple of things that I thought were interesting. So for me, when I started to make the pivot to sustainability and felt like my company started focusing on building sustainability programs. So when I say that, they were trying to figure out, how do we get into hydrogen? How do we get into carbon capture? Biofuels was starting to take off even more. So beyond just like ethanol, but it was really sustainable aviation fuel and green diesel. So that was in 2021. But if you really look back, 2015 was when the actual Paris Agreement, that's where you hear all the net zero by 2020, 2050 type of language. It was almost, when I look at that gap, that's almost about kind of 6 years. And that's why I kind of bolded or italicized this sort of commercialized trends piece, because I think we know in the energy industry space, a lot of times, trends happen in other spaces or industries or the focus areas. And in the case of sustainability, Europe was actually very strongly focused on this, as I started to dive in more and more ahead of the game. And some of our European competitors were more ahead of focusing on this than the US was. And, a lot of sustainability is regulation driven, but it was just kind of interesting to see the gap there. And I'd also say the same thing. In 2016, I first heard like the term digital transformation and sort of IIoT. And back then, everybody was just saying you need to digitally transform. They weren't really talking about a problem to solve, like, okay, digitally transform to improve sustainability or to improve reliability or to optimize. It was very much just you need to buy sensors, you need to do the cloud, you need to be cyber secure. Like it was IT, OT converging. You know, everyone was just talking at it in a language that was very technology oriented, not necessarily like people, process, outcome oriented. And then, you know, the pandemic started to 4 years later, maybe where we started to see digitalization in certain aspects kick off a bit more. And then I would say last year in 2022, 2023 timeframe. So the first kind of like, I think when I read back, Chat GPT, the first maybe like where it became kind of publicly where we started having the ability to access it on a wider range was November 2022. And I would say in 2023, in the last year, we've heard so much about Gen AI and that evolving. However, like things like AI and this stuff has been around for a while, right? So it's kind of interesting when I plotted this out to see some of the delays in, you know, knowing about these things or knowing these were up and coming. Yet when I say we, like really where I'm starting to see whether it's a vendor or whether it's an end user really starting to actually commercialize this, these sort of aspects. So with that, I will pause. And Juliana, I'm going to go back to you to ask, you know, did anyone chat anything else, or do you have anything to chime in based on what you're seeing?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, because I think it's really interesting to kind of look back and see where points are, like things start accelerating and kind of where we are now. And I agree with you. I mean, we saw a big shakeup in the oil and gas industry in 2015, 2016, you know, and then the pandemic, I feel like, started accelerating people thinking about different ways to work, where they were, I felt like we were kind of against. It's a very in the office, right here. And you just had to adapt and change. And what's interesting about ChatGPT now is it kind of, some people are still being careful about what they use personally, because there are certain rules that companies are still working with, how they want to manage generative AI within their corporations. But it kind of opened up something for us to play with in our own lives. Like, can I create a drink menu for my friend's birthday party using ChatGPT? What ideas do they come up with, right? And so it kind of opened it up almost from let's see if we can play with this from a personal aspect, and then think about like how it can affect our industry in different ways. Some of the tools like that are out there, you know, a lot of 3D scanning, and I mean, I worked in apparel way back when, and we were using a lot of more innovative tools to move really quickly, because it's all about doing things quickly, doing things that really reduce cost. And it's interesting to think about sometimes the apparel industry. There's stuff going back and forth across the world constantly, and fast fashion is a huge thing. Now we're looking at fast fashion as, now we need to kind of slow down and we need to be more sustainable. But like back in 2003, I remember working on some scanning 3D people and then fitting clothes virtually on them. And so when you see the oil and gas industry starting to just talk about it more, things that have been in other industries starting to talk it more, like more than 10 years later, it's nice to see that like there's coming some adjustments in the industry that's really opening it up to be, it's really being more creative, not only about how you operate, but also, I think it's to your point, is some of these came out as something cool, but it really didn't show the value to the end user as easily. So now it's fitting in not only to, hey, this is a cool tool, it's fitting into, this is how it actually adds value to your business. And like, I know right now at Honeywell, you're in kind of an interesting group where you're a little bit more dynamic, because you're kind of the, right, almost this little department that has a little bit more of entrepreneurial spirit.
Wow. This has been so you can kind of see I've worked, if you look kind of just like at the, the bottom of these companies that I've worked for, they're very core automation companies in the space that service very heavily oil and gas, as well as, discrete and hybrid industries as well. Very diversified companies with their portfolio, a lot of same core markets, but different kind of market penetration that varies across the companies. And so I have a pretty, I guess, familiar context, as well as I've interned at, traditional oil and gas companies. So I have a familiarity of like the company culture, right, around the energy industry or oil and gas space. And what's been interesting is moving into the software world, right, industrial software. So like, we're not like, a Microsoft, right, like a core software kind of company, IBM, right, that is like what they've always been. Seeing these automation companies start to evolve to become software players, right? Industrial specific software players, where it's software that's not, necessarily enterprise level, but really where expertise is required, right? That bridge between the operational side and your business systems. And so within Honeywell, it's very much like, I feel like I'm in a startup. Even though it's a very established company, the particular division I am in, I have never seen so many changes that like go on, and how fast software gets developed versus hardware. And that was something that, I'm having to retool on my career. Like I said, I could tell, like, dollar wise, a lot of these companies were shifting and saying software is our focus. And so what ends up happening is these hardware businesses just become cut cost, right? Like long term, it's just how do we keep cutting cost, right? It's not about as much of innovating new products or new markets, right? It comes down to like operational being the cash cow that funds where the innovation is. And with the technology side, so like AI/ML, some of these software, the software portfolio that Honeywell has, some of these technologies have deployed AI/ML, what we would view as traditional AI/ML for AI or machine learning for a while. But now like the generative AI piece, I think that is one of the fastest I've seen. Like if I was to plot this chart where we said Chat GPT was end of 2022, I would say like in 23, I felt like to now, especially, you're starting to see more companies like so quickly within a year start to talk about how they're looking at generative AI, whether it's internally or embedding it in their products for people to use externally. That's probably the fastest uptake I have seen in this space in my career.
Yeah, and I think it really, I mean, it's just changing every day. And it's really interesting to see how, like, from just a training perspective, like that people could really latch onto that very quickly. Like, how do I make sure that I have tools and resources easily available to my employees and customers and things like that. And what's interesting is to see how it's going to continue to grow. And I also want to make sure, y'all, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A or the chat. Just please feel free to kind of ask questions or get involved or raise your hand or so I don't know. Yeah, good.
If you didn't mind, I was wanting to jump into this.
Yes, perfect.
Building off of our discussion. So I kind of thought of this in a couple ways of when you brought in like the energy industry, like just like looking across, not, necessarily value chain specific of, upstream, downstream. But one of the things I kind of really wanted to leave you guys with or kind of jump off of is, okay, these are kind of on the left, I put megatrends, and in reality, I say they're interlinked. And then really the technology piece, often what we'll see, what we kind of talked about in the chart was like when people announced digital transformation, IoT, cloud, everybody kind of throws a technology out at the market, but not necessarily linking it to the problem right away, right? And then your marketing people come in and they connect it for you. And so what I wanted to do with this slide was kind of really maybe help ground you as you think about your career of what are the problems that we as an industry are trying to solve. So if I was to throw this chart up when I interned at Exxon and ConocoPhillips in like 2011, 2012, I remember we were trying to go deep water into Gulf of Mexico. You know, maybe it would have been like, oh, there's a shale oil boom, right? Like there was, you know, there was maybe all these sort of different types of crude, or refineries were trying to take advantage of opportunity crudes. Like it was kind of focused there. But now you look, and I feel like, although those challenges may still exist, right? The focus of where we're headed and kind of maybe assessing yourself of, am I solving one of these problems, right? Am I tethered to one of these problems, right? Because every company, every industry, right? We have our normal day-to-day operation we have to upkeep, right? The energy transition, you know, we have a 2050 goal, which is what? Still, I keep forgetting what year we are, 2024, right? So we're still quite a bit away from that. But even I've seen forecasts way past 2050 that will still say, right, fossil fuels will still have majority of the energy mix, right? It's not an easy overnight. It's not even a 20-year journey. So we still have our core that we have to maintain. What I'm trying to submit to you guys is more so, if you are wanting to either stay relevant, be ahead, get the best potential opportunities you can, build out and learn and grow, this is what I think or would recommend to be focusing on. And so one of the things with the problem, so the labor skills shortage, so this is something that is actually like across the board. It's not just oil and gas, but this is also heavily in the discrete manufacturing space, like welders, like just like so many different types of skills required. The great crew change was basically saying in this current time period that we're in now, I think it was something like 50% of like oil and gas personnel will be retiring. And so this number one challenge, when usually I'm hearing the people talk about AI/ML, especially generative AI, it's usually tethered to this first problem here of you know, when you think about generative AI, as Juliana was saying, it's basically taking things we used to be able to do, knew how to do, right? That we would Google, it would take time to aggregate, and we would pull it together. So many use cases that I'm seeing companies deploy with generative AI is so interesting. I feel like it's almost like, I don't know if I would say it's a great equalizer, but in it's a sense that it is not functional exclusive. So like I've seen internally at Honeywell where they've incorporated in IT. They're looking at it with software engineers to better like program and code faster. They're looking at it with like, I hope for marketing, like making slides takes forever. So like, I wish I had a generator, right? Like there's so many ways that it goes cross-functional. So that's like a really big one. And then there's all this other stuff related to just, I think as you go on, so it's about, okay, how do we build a sustainable future, right? And there's the environmental component, but there's also the resourcing, the people component, right? Which technology can help with some of those gaps. And then there's, you know, how do we leverage digitalization to keep building the future, right? And to run more autonomously where, you know, we don't have to have people in the field as much. We can enable remote work, right? And how do we make sure all of this is secure? So all of this is interlinked is like my kind of point of view, or what I wanted to kind of help ground people on when we look at these challenges. And then the how to solve is really the technology enablers and what they can do. And I know we focused a lot on saying AI/ML, cloud, edge. I did want to also highlight the climate technology piece. So I put like new energies, carbon capture. So that's another area of it. It doesn't have to necessarily be software, digital specific, right? But there are new climate technologies to produce new energies coming out as well. So I'm going to pause there.
Yeah, thank you so much. So do we have any questions from anyone? I mean, I think this is great. I think also like it makes me think too, with some of the things that we're implementing, like the more we add technology wise, like we also use more energy. So it becomes more important to find different types of energy and add that to the overall mix. And I think it's interesting to see kind of where we're going with that in the
Yeah,
future.
and I think it's a really good point because so I like have my phone behind me, but I'm always bad about like putting on the flashlight. So I was at this like tech summit. I don't know if my flashlight's on. Here we go.
Oh yeah.
And I remember the I think it was, I don't remember the company this person was for, but he did a talk on Gen AI and he was like, take your phone and sway it back and forth like this, you know, like you would at a concert, right? And he's like, do that for like a day and a half, something like that. And that's like the amount of energy consumed when you like put one prompt into Chat GPT. And so like that is something that we're not necessarily like talking about of like, there are limitations, right? Every technology, everything we do, there are always constraints. And, you know, the amount it takes to train a model of energy, right? And so it's like kind of a give or take, right? Of like, there's ways to operate more sustainably, to use the technology to actually capture sustainable benefits. But then there's also the trade-off of the energy it takes to get those answers or use those tools that we need as well.
True.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so it's
it'll
a
be
good
interesting to see how it continues to evolve. I personally use ChatGPT and, different AI generated by like every day. So I mean, it saves me a bunch of time, but then I wonder like really kind of what my overall impact is on my, from a sustainability standpoint.
Yeah. And I think that brings a great topic because I had wanted to put this together as well, just because I get asked this a lot of, when we talk about sustainability or the energy transition, that's another area of focus, right? So we kind of talked a lot about the technology side, and how technology can solve problems. But the other area that you can look at and evaluate your current job or career path, right? And think about where opportunities may be emerging, I would say is kind of in this space. So I really like our Honeywell CEO. He always says, for Honeywell, like where their focus is on green molecules, not green electrons, which I think is like really catchy of a saying, because we're more focused on like the hydrocarbon processing side, which is like our core. But I added a third category of green practices. So this kind of is like a nice little like kind of checklist of, seeing when we talk about where our industry as a whole is headed in the future, and what sustainability looks like, it's kind of under these three categories. So you can kind of see to the left is more so when we talk about like the new energy spaces. And then if you're on the far right of the chart where maybe you're still at a core fossil fuel based, energy operation or production, then you probably want to be looking at how are you maybe implementing or looking at these practices to operate more sustainably. So your career is likely in the next 2050 beyond going to fall if you remain in the energy industry, right? It's going to be falling either kind of to the left, right of here or to the right, right? I think all are going to be, required to make this transition and to meet those goals. But this is kind of, if you were to think about in a nutshell, I feel like this is like a good summary slide. So whether and how you solve it, right? With the green practices, there's ways to take AIML the same way there is to the left of how different technologies can be deployed. But when you look at what our industry, I would encourage maybe thinking of these sort of three buckets, where you fall into, where you want to fall into, right, in the future or support, and functionally how you want to do that. So I feel like this is a good sort of here's where our future is headed type of slide.
Yeah, I really like this slide. I kind of like how you spell out green molecules, green electrons to like distinguish kind of that difference, but then also the green practices. I mean, I think we'll all be needing to implement certain pieces of this. And I mean, there's great strides in emissions monitoring and reporting. Like there are a lot of tools that are out there that encourage people to, and I mean, a lot of it is, it's based on an algorithm and an estimate. Some of it is based on actual emissions. But what's interesting is it encourages people to look more detailed, like at what their emissions are and what their processes are doing. And then that goes hand in hand with some of these others.
Yeah, and I would say like most companies are starting on the far right, unless it's like a startup in the left two spaces where they're, because a lot of this technology is still, so like, for example, biofuels. So green diesel, I think on my chart, it took off starting really like 2020, end of 2020, 2021 timeframe through the last few years, with how many different plants were coming online. Like it was an insane build out in the US. However, like the technology for sustainable aviation fuel, that's another one that people are talking about. Like Honeywell UOP is one of a process licensor for that. They've made this technology 15 to 20 years ago. It's like been improved, but it's like the scaling in terms of cost, feasibility, engineering, design, right? We hear the same thing for hydrogen, right? Everybody's starting to talk about it. We haven't really seen the uptake yet. It's starting to build out, but everyone keeps saying, when. do we really see the boom coming? Same thing, like I feel like I've heard of solar since I was like a kid, right? And now I maybe see like more of it, right? People start knocking on your house in Houston trying to sell you a solar roof for 20 years, right? Like you don't have to pay. They like are like you don't have to pay for 20
Yeah,
years or something, right? Like they have
yeah,
some sort of catch all of how they're trying to get this sort of uptake. But I would say to the very far right, most companies have, and digital transformation has been a good enabler, right? The tool set that comes with digital transformation, it has tethered in well with sustainability to enable, to your point, like predictive emissions monitoring, or, you know, any of these sort of others kind of use cases or designer evaluations. So even if you're not maybe there where you see your career pivoting to the left, those are kind of maybe more emerging. You probably want to make sure in some way you're looking at, especially if you're in an operations role or a design role for processes, somehow how you're incorporating this stuff to the right.
yeah. Great. Again, please ask some questions if you can. I know we're going through a lot. Oh, we got one. How do you see government policies affecting projects in these spaces? That's a
Yeah,
good.
this one is so tricky. It was kind of funny. I like had this discussion at lunch because we have a big emissions sort of portfolio. And I was like, it depends who gets elected of how well that product is going to do in the next few years,
Yeah,
you know, in the US, like truly as like, you know, it's very, very hard. So I would say like, let me go back to my like kind of chart over here. So when this US green diesel race happened in 2021, what made it feasible was the fact that there was I think it was called like a refiners blenders tax credit. There was some sort of tax credit that the government put in place. On top of that, California made something called like the low carbon fuel standard. And basically it incentivized refiners. I can't even remember how much profit they were making now per barrel extra. So basically what's happening is with a lot of this sort of climate tech, you really need government incentives. So like I think Biden just did the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Where you really need government incentives to get the shift from fossil fuel based production, because fossil fuel based continues to be, it's built out for a long time. The infrastructure is in place. It is the cheapest, most cost effective way right now, right, to still make energy. And so the regulatory landscape for building out new energies and even for sustainability regulations and reporting is really critical. Europe leads with the sustainability regulations, and kind of just like the effort and the investment you see in that space because of that. But it's extremely critical. I'm curious to see like how the election pans out. You'll either see a continuation or discontinuation, basically, probably of some of this stuff is like honestly how it goes when we're in a year like this. So, yeah.
yeah, and I get the feeling just how companies are planning and doing their hiring and things right now. Everyone's a little unsure of which way it's going to go. But yeah, so I think it'll be interesting. And you're right, like it is a lot to build out infrastructure, and so that I think that's why why we always see certain green molecules being like discussed a little longer, right? Because it's a huge to take different paths. Like back forever ago, we were talking about using algae as a main energy source. And then we realized, well, we couldn't get the amount of energy out of that. Like we didn't have the land to like grow enough. And so we found that wind works better and implementing solar in certain places. But also I think we still are working on like storage issues.
Battery storage, yeah. There's so much, and even like, you know, with green hydrogen, people debate the water use required for it, like how sustainable is it? You know, same thing what you said with biofuels, competing with food crops, like the price in the last few years in the US of like the value of like soybean oil or corn oil, right? Like just these feedstocks that maybe used to go just to ethanol that are able to go to green diesel or sustainable aviation fuel, or is it competition against food crops, right? There's so much regulation required. Like it's not an easy problem, but I guess I would say in our industry, whoever asked that question is very wise, because you know that really for us to kick and do some of these things, we need to be regulated, you know,
Yes.
to do things that we've always known we probably should do, right? That, you know, uh, operate like there's so much low hanging fruit. Like if I was to go back to that green practices side, um, even I see this on like the asset reliability space that like I work in, of just basic, whether it's like energy monitoring of an asset, right? Or people are only monitoring the critical stuff, but when you, the critical equipment in a plant is usually only 20% of your overall equipment, right? So that's still almost 80% of your equipment that if you were to add up the balance, like maybe they're not necessarily mission critical to shut down your process, but they're still big energy consumers, right? When you add it up, there's so much maybe latent opportunities, or opportunities that we know that are low hanging fruit. Like I remember in the refining space a few years ago, trying to talk about different energy saving applications. And, you know, the energy engineers are like, we're aware, but the ROI is so low, right? I don't know, from a financial standpoint. From a sustainability and maybe an emissions consequence, it'll start to add up, right? And that
Yeah.
goes to the fines, the taxes that maybe are now going to get tacked on versus just an energy bill, right? I think I had on my chart, so like the unfortunately, the geopolitical crisis that you see in Europe. Sometimes if you pay attention to the news, you'll hear like this power plant went down, right? Okay, LNG had a shift because they lost, you know, Russia as a source, or Ukraine, right? Like there's so many different geopolitics and different factors that contribute to an energy crisis. And the pricing for Europe, I can't even remember like how high it went up to at a certain point when I was working on this a couple of years ago. But you see a lot of even beyond regulations, some geopolitics that actually do, as we know, impact our energy pricing. And
Yeah.
so that sometimes makes energy projects like a really big deal, right? Because of what the cost of energy is. And then sometimes when an energy is super affordable, you know, it's not as much of a priority, right? So there's a lot of these sort of shifts. But sustainability and emissions consequences have added another incentive beyond just pricing, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And that's, I think, it kind of just, it gives a different way for companies to look at their impact.
Yes.
And they're being held accountable by their consumers, customers, users of their energy.
Yeah. And I will say, I have heard from companies that shifting into these new energies and new spaces, it has completely brought in some new talent or revitalized the talent of people being like really interested, right? You know, energy gets such a bad rap, even though what we offer and provide powers so much of the world, so many economies. It's very, although there's a lot of high risk, it's like I am feel more in danger like trying to park my car and go into like a Target, you know, than like you know, how we safely operate our plants, right? Like I'm more prone to incidences like outside, out and about, you know, when I commercially go
Yeah.
to a mall or something, right? That like, or in my office, right? Versus like actually like when you look at truly the number of safe operating hours our industry has, how responsible we have to be, right? We sometimes get this sort of feel like a misview of us, right? And all that we do and what we power, right? People don't have that full understanding of the value of what the energy industry unlocks for our daily living. And so, you know, it's good to see like this sort of new chart coming where we are headed this way, and it creates so much excitement and opportunities. And like I said, I'll flip back to this slide where it's like there are new problems to solve that we even just 10 years ago weren't existing. And these are some really cool new ways to solve those problems now. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's great. Do you want to go quickly through your last slide and we'll see if there's any more questions from the audience?
Sure. I think,
We're a little
yeah.
over, but I think it's good because we still have some people hanging on. So
Okay. Yeah. So I will kind of just like, and I think Juliana had to ask me about, you know, where technology and sustainability intersect. So I took this from the Honeywell ESG report because I thought they did like a really nice job of capturing kind of all the like ESG in a nutshell. And there's areas that I don't play into that Honeywell does, like aerospace. So I was like kind of stayed away from, you know, touching those. But I kind of highlighted a few areas, but I looked at this in two categories of some of these are enablers for green practices, like we talked about, and then some are enablers for green molecules. So what you'll see for the green practices side, so when it comes to like taking our existing energy production that we have today, how do we reduce the carbon footprint? So how do we reduce energy use and emissions? A couple of the kind of big areas. So Juliana touched on this with emissions monitoring and all that has gone in to digitalize that, automate it more, make it more predictive, more accurate in reporting, streamlining it, scaling it now. And it's not just, I would even say monitoring is maybe too less of a word. It's probably more management is probably a better term now, because in the past, monitoring just implied kind of just like, okay, I measure it, right? But now it's more, it's not enough to measure it. You have to reduce it, right? And is with the regulations. And so there's a lot kind of being built out into that space from so like, even I was at a conference, at an LNG conference in January, where the presentation on my track before me was like, I felt like it was like very like Elon Musk Tesla-esque, where it was like launching a satellite into space that will like monitor your emissions, like at a very, high level, like sort of area level. And it's like satellite emissions monitoring as an offering, and it
Okay.
was like so bizarre to me, right? Of like what, like what they are commercializing now as solutions. So it's not just even sensors on the ground, right? Like there's satellites coming out. So there's like just stuff that we've not seen before that, is starting to emerge. Asset performance management, this is a big space that I'm currently playing into of, it's something that's been done for a very long time. However, the AI and ML are unlocking even better prediction capabilities to move to like predictive maintenance, things like that. So those are, kind of examples that you see of, okay, how do I, basically it's like, how do I manage emissions and energy use? There's things like advanced control. There's so many different kind of solution sets there. For green molecules, that one is more in the design space right now and like the getting up to production space, right? So that is kind of, a lot of this is new. And so a lot of what you see there is where you like, I would say more so digital twins are maybe more quickly adopted in that space compared to ours. So that's like kind of simulating, doing what if analysis, like if you did a certain type of feedstock, if you ran out a certain condition, how would that impact? Because these technologies are not as well known. The response, how they behave, if we're changing to a certain feedstock. So that's where like digital twins really come in handy, process digital twins in particular. And then I would say the other, and Juliana touched on this, and this also kind of relates to, there's a couple, when we talk about skills shortage, but also the changing workforce dynamic, like, we are more digitally native than the traditional core workforce of our industry, right? And so there's things like augmented reality and virtual reality simulators. There's just ways that training is getting more enhanced, doesn't require to be, in a field or build a lab like it used to, right? And so those are like maybe a couple more of the areas where you're seeing, how do I accelerate the design and scaling of these things? And it usually relates to, how do I more quickly and optimally design, as well as how do I quickly train these people and get everything verified and validated and commissioned faster? So you're seeing kind of the technology, maybe same technology capabilities, but they play a little bit different of a role depending on the cycle of the type of energy or the maturity of the type of energy.
Well, and
So again,
also, right? Like also it's, because I think it's a great point that you brought up, is it's also the ability of the workforce, like the people that you're working with, to understand what the technology can do. It's like when Pokemon Go came out, like, I mean, everyone's like, what does this mean for us? I'm like, it can mean things. Like, I mean, you're looking at people that are now they're taking their phone and they're using it to interact with what's around them, and see different things. And so there is a difference when you have kind of younger generations who are growing up with this. I think we're all at slightly different points of like, when, I mean, I was in high school and I think we just started, like, we had cell phones, but like it wasn't like it is today in any way.
yeah. And it's a great point because one of the things I know, Juliana, you and I talked about this like pre this discussion is, there's our barriers to technology adoption. So you think about change management, like I'll be honest, I cannot keep up with all the like different Microsoft updates that I keep getting of like they are enabling so many features like AIM ML stuff, like, just like even things like they now know like where my coworkers, what region they are and they're like and their working hours and they're like, do you want to schedule send, right? Like there's some of these sort of advanced, there's like meeting notes that can be derived from this call alone and it'll summarize for you. But I don't know how to like unlock all those capabilities. And I'll be honest, I don't really want to take an IT training, to learn to do that, just because I'm just like, I don't have the time for it. So it has to be very intuitive. And really, I would say the generative AI piece, like the chat bots, right, where they automate instructions for you, the things that those are able to do are going to help technology be adopted easier, right? Or utilized
Yeah.
easier. And so that's one of the opportunities we're seeing is like, how do we make the user experience like better by incorporating something like generative AI? And because otherwise, like, advanced control systems, asset reliability, performance management, this stuff has been around for a while. So much of the data, right? Like to make all this technology work, AI, ML, it requires data that you already have, right? And so it's like, we've had this stuff sitting around. It's just not in an easy enough way, even if it's digitalized, right? Or digitized, right? It's just somehow still not easy enough for us to get to and unlock and do all the features, right? We need it so automated, but our workforce, right? Like in our own personal life, like you said, we're used to much more convenience. And so it's going to be expected the same way when we do our jobs going forward as well, right?
Yeah, I think it's more and more important. I mean, it's always been important to look at user experience and how they're using it. I think we're seeing a shift in like how we're adapting to that and like understanding, just because it's a cool tool, it really also has to be easy to use as well. And how can we use these other tools to really make it as effective as possible?
Yes. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what we said at the beginning when 2016 was like digital transformation started to become a buzzword, but it was all about the technology, cloud, this, that, right? And it was like nothing about like, what else can you do? What are all the actually like outcomes, right? Like what are the problems you can solve and how do you use it, right? And that's where I've seen the shift in the messaging through the years to the outcome, right? Where you're actually connecting. So, it's going back to that side of, I can throw up that technology, but you should be mapping it to a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think that's great with your background in marketing because as you said, like that's a big thing to kind of connect that technology with the people so that you're not just creating a technology, you are solving a problem. And so awesome. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And feel free if like Juliana has my contact info, connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to have more of a discussion or just like learn more about maybe any of the spaces or areas I've talked about. I'm happy to chat and Women's Masters Network and energy gigs. Like I know this is like I think kicking off the summer series that y'all are doing. And so
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to attending. I watched some of the past recordings on YouTube before I like did this session. And so I'm really looking forward to participating more. And I'm glad this is virtual so I can participate since I'm not in Houston anymore. But great events. So thank you, Juliana.
Thank you so much. And it's so good to catch up with you. And obviously, I mean, we'll catch up offline too. Yeah, so for the rest of the series, we're doing a summer series. So with Women in Energy, um, sponsored by Energy Gigs. And so it's going to be the second Wednesday of each month. Next is June 12th. That's with Christina Clavers. And then we have July 10th with Stephanie Seals and August 14th with Catherine Colbert. And she's running for Railroad Commission. So it's kind of neat.
That's cool.
Yeah, yeah. So thank you so much. Please check out we have some in Houston events coming up too. We have one in July that's a Dress for Success combination event with Women of Wardrobe. That's going to be our next in person. That'll be a lot of fun. And yeah, see you. I can't wait to see you as like on the attendee side too, Meha, for the next ones,
Yeah.
because then I know
Yeah.
we
I'm
have a ton
looking
of
forward.
questions.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, I really enjoyed, like, I watched the geothermal one. That one was really good because that's such a like new space for me. I don't know much about, and so it's like impressive, but I'm looking forward to the other women and hearing what they have to say as well and share and learn. So thank you all for attending. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'll see you all around.